So for the last year or so, I've had these rolling deadlines that were just hanging over my head like the sword of Damocles. And they kept me from doing things that I've wanted to do for a long time, like edit these videos, or read recreationally, or go for walks, or respond to your emails. Sorry about that. But as of about 2 hours ago, those deadlines have kind of receded a little bit, giving me a moment to breathe. Summer is upon us. And so for the first time in a very long time, I was able to wander over to my bookshelf, find a random book that the fairy whim had me wanting to read, and just go to a field and read it for a while. And it was a divine experience, but also a little bit saddening, because it reminded me of who I was back when I had time to be myself, like 10, 15 years ago, before grad school, before teaching. The book was called Wild Fruits by Henry David Thoreau. And it's not like his other works, his famous ones like Walden or Walking or Life Without Principle. Those were great and formative for me, but they focused on philosophy and simplicity and such. This one is actually just an exploration of wild fruits, because as Thoreau got into botany, he started going on walks and recording what he found. Every day he would start with studying, and then in the afternoon he would go for a walk, and then in the evening he would study again, and reading and writing and whatnot. But on his walks through his hometown in Concord, he would just make a note of what plant he saw in bloom for the first time, or what fruit was ripening and when. And he ended up compiling his observations together into a chronological book that describes what's happening in spring to the plants in Concord, and moves through the summer into the fall, and what fruits are ripening when, so that if you had the book, you could kind of follow along with him as he goes through the seasons and finds these plants. And although the book is mainly about wild fruits and where they're found and how they grow and what historians have said about them in the past, he does wax a little philosophical in the introduction, which is all I had time to read after my deadlines passed away. And I hope to continue reading it going forwards, but the introduction describes why he thinks looking for wild edibles is important, and why it's maybe better than buying food just from the market. And he starts the introduction by just describing how we are in relation to our fields around us typically. He says that most of us are still related to our native fields as a navigator to undiscovered islands in the sea. So there's a lot out there that we're just not familiar with, that we haven't discovered yet, even in our own little towns, even in our own little backyards. He goes on to say that he's going to sail the unexplored sea of Concord, Massachusetts, where he lives, and tell us what he finds, essentially. A little bit later, he talks about something that I found rather convicting, especially right now. He says that it is not the orange of Cuba, but rather the checkerberry of the neighboring pasture that most delights the eye and the palate of the New England child. For it is not the foreignness, or the size, or the nutritive qualities of a fruit that determine its absolute value. I think it's a little convicting because I've been eating a lot of citruses, since I don't have time for lunches lately. I just eat a grapefruit, or my student introduced me to sumo oranges, so I've been buying a lot of those and ignoring the local fruits around me. My student said I've been citrus maxing. But so there's more to a fruit than its foreignness, its size, or its nutritive qualities, and its absolute value is not just dependent on those things. He goes on to kind of give an example of that, saying that the South may keep her pineapples, and we will be content with our strawberries, which are, as it were, a pineapple with going a strawberrying stirred into them, infinitely enhancing their flavor. So the very act of exploring to find the strawberries and then picking them yourself enhances their flavor and adds value to the expedition, if you will. And even later on, he talks about expeditions to get fruit. And for example, he says that if someone buys a ship and sails it to go buy a bunch of pineapples and then brings them back to the US and sells them for a profit, he would have been considered to have had a successful venture. But for Thoreau's part, he says that he's more interested in a child's first excursions a huckleberrying, in which the kid is introduced to a whole new world and experiences a new development, though it brings home only a gill of berries in a basket. So he says that's more valuable than the excursion because someone has gone and discovered something in his surroundings and grown through that discovery and gotten connected to his community and to nature more than someone who just sailed to a place and picked up a bunch of pineapples and sailed them back. So he's more impressed by a kid going huckleberrying than by commercial endeavors. And he says that newspapers and politicians will say that the expedition for pineapples is a more productive endeavor, but he says that doesn't change the fact. And he goes on to say that the added value that is given to the kid who's going huckleberrying for the first time makes his expedition more fruitful, which is a lovely little pun there. Later on in this introduction, he alludes to the fact that the fruits we buy in the market are not necessarily the best fruits, but rather just the fruits that will ship well. He says, "That on which commerce seizes is always the very coarsest part of a fruit, the mere bark and rind, in fact, for her hands are very clumsy. Commerce's hands are clumsy. The fruits will bruise in transit or over-ripen. And so the bananas that we have in our stores in North America are just the ones that will ship well, not the best tasting ones. And there are loads of fruits around us that are delicious and useful, but just aren't in stores because they don't ship well or keep well. A lot of our fruits we pick unripened and let them be ripened later on when they're closer to the consumer, and they're not quite as good because of that." One fruit that comes to mind is the pawpaw, which is a tree that grows this kind of weird sideways kind of pear fruit that has the consistency of bread but a sweet tropical flavor. And it is a great fruit, but it doesn't ship well, and so it's not found in stores typically, although some local people will make produce out of it, which is great. But I said earlier that I took this book out and was reading it in a field, and I'm not in a field anymore, so why is that? Well, that's because after reading this introduction, I was inspired to just wander off and see what I could find around me. And within 1 minute, I found the beautiful path that I put at the beginning of this video. And within 2 minutes of that, I found these little guys here. If you don't know, these guys are called May apples, and they're a very elusive and delicious wild edible, one that I have a long history of hunting. So they form these beautiful umbrella leaves, and then between the stems of the plant that has a bifurcation, a branching point, it'll form a beautiful flower, and that flower will turn into a single fruit that is the May apple. And I've heard it described that it is a very ethereal tasting fruit, although I've hunted it and never successfully eaten it because it's such a delicious fruit that all the animals beat me to it typically, and it's only available for a short window before these plants all die back spontaneously and at once. So I wanted to introduce you to this lovely little plant, both because I wanted to share the joys of finding a little wild edible with you, but also because I wanted to use it as a sort of transition into the next video I hope to make. I mentioned that this plant is relatively short-lived. It grows up quickly and then dies back quickly. And because of that, I've actually missed most of this season of this plant because I've been too busy. The flower that it produces is a gorgeous, beautiful smelling flower, and that's already long gone, replaced by a fruit that's already halfway towards being ripe. And I've just been too busy to come out here and find these plants and notice that. And I would have completely missed them had I not taken a moment to read Thoreau and then be inspired to go off into the woods again. So I'm going to give you a quote from another Thoreau book. It's actually one of his essays called Life Without Principle. He says that there is nothing, not even crime, more opposed to poetry, to philosophy, aye, to life itself, than this incessant busyness. Or as he might have been to business, but I think busyness. And this comment that Thoreau is making here, the idea that if we are too busy, we miss out on some of the beauties in life, is exactly what A.G. Sertalanger says in The Intellectual Life. a book that you guys suggested I come back to and revisit, because it was the first book I ever covered on this channel, and I only covered the first half of it. And now that I have a little bit of time, I want to go back and visit the quotes that were in the second half of that book, both as a sort of exercise in and an exhortation to slowing down and breathing a little bit so that we can enjoy more of life and be more ourselves. I'll see you then. Cheers. I'm coming back for you, though.